It just keeps going. Ukraine is trying to encircle Russian soldiers right here, inside of Russia's own territory. But trying and doing are two different things. So, will it work? Well, I suppose that is a question of bridges, political risks inside of Russia, and the shadows of Ukraine's 2022 counteroffensive. Oh, and I guess a touch of HIMARS. But let's get to it. At the time of production, this is about where Ukraine's offensive lies. Last time, we focused on the railways that Ukraine was pinching along the border region. However, today, we turn to a natural geographic feature. A river, specifically the Sem River. It runs from deeper into Russia before eventually crossing into Ukraine. And if we overlay Ukraine's offensive, you can see what the strategists in Kyiv are attempting to do. There are only 3 ways to supply Russian troops in the region: crossing the river, ignoring Ukraine's army and going right across it, and rushing through this narrow passageway that may no longer be there tomorrow. So much for that one. Meanwhile, more than 2 weeks into the offensive, Russia still does not seem particularly interested in the second option. As for the first, well, Ukraine is erasing that one from the playbook entirely. Within the segment of the river that Russia has easy access to, there are only 3 bridges. Here, here, and here. Well, actually, I should say there were 3 bridges. Ukraine has destroyed 2 of them and damaged the third to the point that heavy vehicles can no longer cross it. Unsurprisingly, much of the speculation is that HIMARS were responsible. On one hand, this gives us a good sense of where Ukraine thinks its offensive will culminate, at least along the front's western edge. That is the good news for Russia. On the other hand, it presents a stark problem for Russian soldiers facing de facto encirclement. Yes, technically this is a river, and it is the world's ugliest looking circle, but it is the same idea. Now, this is not the first time that Russia has confronted such a problem. Let's rewind to the fall of 2022 and move from the offensive in Kursk down to the southern end of Ukraine. Here again, there were Russian soldiers on the opposite side of 3 bridges crossing a river, this time the Dnipro. And this time, the target was the city of Kherson, which Russia had captured in the opening week of the invasion. It was the maximum, at least thus far, of Russia's gains in the south, and arguably the most valuable of any city that Russia has occupied during the invasion at any time. As such, Russia invested a ton in its defense early on, but the tide began to turn once the United States began supplying Ukraine with HIMARS. Gimler's rockets had enough distance to pepper whatever Ukraine wanted to hit in the area, including the vehicle bridge and the rail bridge next to the city, as well as the road crossing further upriver along the then-standing Kakhovka Dam. From there, Ukraine slowly laid siege to the area, draining Russian soldiers of their supplies while incrementally approaching the city. It took a few months and involved a separate counteroffensive in Kharkiv, but eventually the Kremlin faced a dilemma. Either risk having a large segment of its forces trapped in Kherson, or withdraw across the river. Despite having formally declared Kherson a part of the Russian Federation just over a month earlier, along with a bunch of other oblasts, the military's needs ultimately trumped political inconveniences. As a result, Russian troops carefully crossed what remained of the vehicle bridge on November 11th, dropping an entire section behind them to ensure that Ukraine could not follow. This was perhaps the Kremlin's best major decision of the war. It was a loss in the moment, yes, but it gave time for Russia to construct the Surovikin line that would later withstand Ukraine's 2023 counteroffensive, a line that notably did not extend along the international border. By comparison, the situation in Kursk right now is different on many dimensions. As a starting point, we are currently in a game of real-time strategy on the battlefield. Meanwhile, the Kherson pinch went on for months, giving both sides much more time to survey what was going on and adopt the appropriate measures and countermeasures. Thus far, Russia has performed better when the battlefield is methodical. Yes, again, Moscow was on the losing side of Kherson, but it made the correct high-level strategic decision. In contrast, Ukraine has had the advantage in situations like Kursk that require live adaptation, which explains in large part why Ukraine wanted to start this offensive in the first place. Put differently, Russia does better in the chess-like segments of the war, while Ukraine does relatively better in the Fortnite-like segments. And yes, this is the first and last time this channel will ever mention Fortnite. Anyway, second, the scale of these operations is night and day. Kherson has a population of about 280,000. In contrast, the western section of Kursk is sparsely populated and was inadequately defended to begin with. As a result, occupied Kherson contained about 30,000 Russian troops, whereas Ukrainian media are reporting only 700 to 800 risk encirclement here. Third, the river sizes are distinct. The Dnipro is multiple football fields wide, and that measure is equally valid whether your name is Raul from Spain or RJ from the United States. Meanwhile, in Kursk, it is less than one football field wide. Here they are from the same altitude to underscore that point. The Dnipro is the most obvious geographic feature, while the Sem just blends in. There it is, in case you missed it. Now, either of those widths prevents tanks, APCs, or otherwise from crossing over on their own. But it is much easier to build pontoon bridges when you do not have far to go. And that will be the next game played. Russia racing to build those pontoons, while Ukraine uses drones to try to find them and then destroy them. Indeed, beyond those 3 real bridges previously destroyed, reports are that Ukraine has spotted 2 pontoons already, and that they have met the fate of the others. Moreover, the bigger problem is that engineering equipment usually has to operate in an exposed area to build them, creating an attractive artillery or drone target aside from the bridge itself. Nevertheless, at least for now, Russia does not seem to be immediately conceding the more than 600 vulnerable square kilometers of territory. Actually, it is less than that now. You see this weird piece of Russian land to the west of the river? Ukraine already captured it. Still, there is a major risk if Russia continues to fight. Or, more precisely, the Russian Ministry of Defense commands those soldiers to fight. What do I mean by that distinction? Well, in all likelihood, anyone left behind is a conscript soldier, people who are legally obligated to serve, and who have not voluntarily found themselves in combat. This creates 2 additional wrinkles, both of which create further strategic problems for Moscow. First, Ukraine captured a large number of prisoners of war at the start of the Kursk offensive, perhaps a couple of thousand. Reports suggest that they did not even try to fight, that they viewed the war as not their responsibility, and certainly not something worth dying over. Consequently, it is possible that even if the Russian MOD tells the stranded soldiers to fight, they may ultimately decide that discretion is the better part of valor, and surrender. Now, this is far from a tipping point that would lead to a breakdown in unit cohesion along the more important Eastern Front. But we discussed last year how combat compliance is a problem for Russia, and that theme seems to be reappearing again in 2024. Second is the soldiers' political importance. We have also discussed before how casualties among that cohort are more likely to cause political trouble in Moscow. Well, holding a bunch of conscripts as prisoners of war will have a similar effect. In turn, there is an expectation that the Kremlin will want to trade them for Ukrainian POWs, to the point that Kyiv is euphemistically describing the offensive as fundraising for that purpose. There is an interesting strategic trade-off here, though. The fact that conscript POWs can cause more political trouble in Moscow discourages Ukraine from actually including them in an exchange. After all, an alternate win condition for Kyiv is to see Putin fall from power, and keeping imprisoned soldiers in Ukraine helps in that direction. However, like a lot of bargaining theory, the likely net effect of this is to merely alter the terms of an agreement rather than foreclose on the ability to get a deal done. Generally speaking, POW trades happen because each side values saving their own soldiers more than prolonging the misery of captured opposing soldiers. This creates an inefficiency, and if there is one thing that you should have learned from this channel by now, it is that inefficiencies give rise to negotiated settlements. Though here it is men, not Miles. Unless, of course, it is a man named Miles. That rare case aside. All this means is that Ukraine will try to extract a premium for conscripts, and reject one-for-one trades. As a final thought here, there is another interesting facet of Ukraine looking to reach the river. One of the problems that Ukraine still faces is a shortage of manpower. However, rivers are natural defensive barriers. Here, that would allow for a smaller footprint to stay behind and stand guard. This is true even in comparison to what the international border looked like before, which did not follow a similar natural barrier. Maybe you now have this guy go elsewhere. Meanwhile, Russia does not get the same benefit here if it is using conscripts at the border, who are not allowed to deploy to the Eastern Front. In fact, these concerns are driving the changes in how Ukraine has adjusted the offensive after the initial surprise wore off. Initially, Ukraine was attempting to punch north and breach Russia's defensive lines. With that mission accomplished, Ukraine has spent more recent days pushing east and west. You see, if the line just pushes outward, you do not create any new line to cover. You just change where the line is. When you make irregular shapes like this, though, the perimeter starts becoming a mess. It also makes supplying the front more difficult when you have to go all the way out to here, when instead you could just go like this. That goes double when the land that you are running past has had all of the infrastructure torn up in the process. All told, many Western observers worried that the Kursk offensive would lead to a shortage of manpower elsewhere. That remains to be seen, but it is possible that success here will reduce that vulnerability, at least as long as those conscripts are not trying to actively regain the lost Russian territory. Another thing that remains to be seen is my books on the war. Well, at least in this arrangement. I've always had How Ukraine Survived on the left. Much better. Anyway, check the video description for more information about them. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care. You know, that is a lot of men, but why is this one guy seemingly in timeout?